Hi, everybody. So, today I'm going to finally tell you guys the story about the day, the sudden realization that I had that finally led me to seeing Watchtower for what it really is. Um, I'm going to try not to make it too long, but if I'm going to tell the story, I'm going to tell it right. So, I guess once I'm done, I'll see how long it ends up being. So, this is taking place in late March of 2015. And just to give you an idea of the kind of mindset that I was in, March in Southern Ontario means that there's nice weather outside for the first time since like October. So it's a very positive time of year, and I'm in a very good mood because of the t-shirt weather outside, and I have a lot of energy, and I feel like I can do anything, and I want to do something productive with all of this energy. And so the most productive thing I could think to do is to study the Bible some more, because of course I'm still operating under the assumption that all scripture is inspired of God and useful for all sorts of things. And but my mindset was a little bit different, subtly different from how it had been previously, because I think I mentioned in other videos that sometimes I would study things in the Bible that would make me a little bit uncomfortable, and I would kind of retreat when that would happen. But on that day, that lingering doubt that I'd mentioned in my last video, it wasn't going away. And I knew that if I kept trying to ignore it, it would still be there. The only way that I could deal with it was to face it head on, basically. That I would, the only way that I could get past this feeling would be to study all the things, whether they make me uncomfortable or not. And if I'm right, it'll come through in the research. And if I'm wrong, which I still thought was very unlikely, but if I am wrong, then all the better, because what was the saying? If we have the truth, it cannot be harmed by investigation. If we have not the truth, then it ought to be harmed. I didn't actually know that quote at the time, but that was basically my mindset going in. So I grabbed my Bible, and I would just pick a book of the Bible and read it from start to finish, and think about what it says and try to figure out what some of the more obscure passages mean. I would pick books specifically because they're difficult and kind of intimidating, because I'm feeling like I can anything I set my mind to, I can handle right now, because I'm in that kind of frame of mind. And one of the books that I read was the book of Daniel. But I got stuck on one particular verse in the book of Daniel, and I'll explain in a bit more detail why it was significant, that particular verse. And ultimately, the reason that it made a big difference for me was because the official Watchtower explanation for this verse is quite possibly the stupidest thing that I've ever read. And that was a huge shock to me when I read this thing. So I'll just read the verse. I was reading Daniel 8, verse 14, where it says, I think I'm quoting here from the New World Translation again, because that's what I was reading. It says, "So he said to me, until 2,300 evenings and mornings, and the holy place will certainly be brought into its right condition." Now, this verse stood out to me for two reasons, basically. The first was that it reminded me of something I had learned previously about a certain individual named William Miller. So obviously I have to tell you a little bit about who William Miller is. William Miller was a Baptist preacher in the early 1800s in the United States who was studying the Bible, and he figured out, or he somehow came to the conclusion, that there were clues in the Bible that would allow one to calculate when the rapture was going to happen. And not surprisingly, the rapture happened to be very, very soon. It's a funny thing about predicting the end of the world, because when you predict the end of the world, it's always, always imminent. No one ever predicts, or it's extremely rare that anyone ever predicts that the end of the world is several hundred years from now. It's always, no matter who's predicting it, no matter when they're predicting it, it's always imminent. And so for William Miller, the imminent end of the world, according to his Bible math calculations, fell on 1844. And the reason that this tied in with Daniel 8:14 was because that was a big part of the calculations that he used. I don't remember what the exact starting point was that he used, but he relied on Daniel 8:14 and the 2,300 days, and that after the 2,300 days, which in Adventist terms was code for 2,300 years, that the math checked out and that it landed on 1844. And that 1844 was going to be the date when the sanctuary would be cleansed. And a lot of people actually took him seriously. This actually became a rather large movement all over the USA and other parts of the world. Even people were eagerly expecting the rapture in 1844 based on these Bible calculations. Now, as strange as it is that, people took this seriously, what's even stranger is what happened afterwards in, say, 1845, give or take, when it finally became obvious to everyone that the world did not end in 1844. You would think that it would be so obvious that everyone would just go, well, I guess that settles it. Turns out we were wrong, and go back to whatever it is they were doing before they got sucked into all this Millerite business. But it turns out that's not what happens. Some people, no doubt, just kind of carry on with their lives, but a lot of them actually become even more convinced after the prediction fails. They come up with some rationalization. They'll say he was right about everything except the math. Maybe he just got the year wrong, or maybe he actually got the year right and the prophecy actually was fulfilled. It was just fulfilled invisibly somehow, not in the way that we expected. And they will cling to this rationalization with such force that they become even more zealous and even more convinced than they were before the prediction failed. And when I read about this is something I had read about previously, and I remember it made a little bit of a connection in my mind with the Bible student movement, which I think I mentioned a minute ago. Because for those of you who know your Watchtower history, and that's including the history that the Watchtower publishes about itself, if you look at the beginnings of Charles Taze Russell, his first interest in Bible interpretation, which led to him starting the Bible student movement, came from certain Adventist preachers that had motivated him to do these thorough Bible researches that we know him for. These are not Seventh-day Adventists, by the way. That's a common misconception. These were Adventists, but not of the Seventh-day variety. By then, there were multiple branches, multiple varieties of Adventists. As far as I know, Charles Russell never studied with any Adventists of the Seventh-day variety. It's a different branch. But the Bible students had their own end of the world that they were looking forward to. Theirs was in 1914, October 1914 to be precise, and they were all expecting to be called beyond the veil. I don't know if they used the word rapture, but that was basically what they were expecting. And they even had these like countdown cards where they're counting down to October 1914, and they were absolutely sure that this was going to pan out. And then when World War I broke out in July of 1914, they thought, oh, this is it. It's the real thing this time. And then October came and October went and the world didn't come to an end and everyone was disappointed. And similarly to the Millerites, again, despite their spectacularly failed prediction, they kept on at least as zealous as they were before. There's even a social psychology theory that was put together that explains this phenomenon in the 1950s. in a book called When Prophecy Fails. That book was about a very different cult. This one was a small UFO cult that had once again predicted the imminent end of the world, and once again, the world disappointed everyone by not ending. And they all convinced themselves that what was their explanation? That they had somehow saved the world, that the apocalypse had been canceled on their account, instead of beaming them up to the spaceship and destroying the whole world in a flood somehow. And so this book, When Prophecy Fails, by the way, is what coined the term cognitive dissonance, because there's these conflicting facts in the mind of the believer. On the one hand, you have this prophecy that's absolutely certain to be fulfilled, and on the other hand, you have the world that hasn't ended, and the person is forced to reconcile these two facts, but is not willing or not able to let go of either of them. So they latch on to one of these rationalizations, and they latch on with such force that they become even more convinced than they were when they started. So looking at the 2,300 days verse in Daniel, and remembering how this was applied by William Miller, how curiously similar to that Russell's Bible student movement was in 1914. This is a connection that I kind of made before, but just kind of filed away under things that make you go, Because, of course, I still believe that the Watchtower was the faithful and discreet slave, and this, up until then, was just a sort of a academic exercise. It was all very hypothetical, and I still thought that, Christ had returned invisibly in 1914, but the connection had been made, and it was the sort of thing that could not be very quickly unmade. Once you see it, it's hard to unsee it. So as I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about Daniel 8:14 and the 2,300 days, and I realize I have no idea what the 2,300 days are supposed to mean. I mean, I remembered there's like the 7 times that you guys might remember that's supposed to point to 1914. I knew what that was supposed to mean. I knew what the 70 weeks was supposed to mean. But the 2,300 days, I drew a complete blank. And it seemed to me that if God gives a prophecy about the rise and fall of world-dominating empires, and that in the middle of this prophecy he gives a specific time frame of 2,300 days, it has to be important. It has to be significant. God's not one to waste our time with things that don't mean anything, at least in theory. So I took another look at the chapter to see what's the context, see what I could piece together, and it's the vision about the there's a he-goat with a great horn who beats up a ram with 2 horns, and then the big horn breaks and 4 horns grow in its place. And a little horn grows out of one of the 4 horns, and the little horn starts doing all kinds of mean and nasty things, and everybody hates it. And that's where verse 14 comes in, is it's a response to the question, how long will the vision be of the constant feature and of the transgression causing desolation, to make both the holy place and the army things to trample on? So it's talking about all these mean and nasty things that the little horn is doing. And I remembered what the background of it was. The he-goat is the king of Greece, and the ram is Persia, and the 4 horns are the 4 kingdoms that emerged after the fall of after the untimely death of Alexander the Great. And all of these things are pretty explicitly spelled out actually later in the chapter. It specifically says, that's the king of Greece, that's Persia. No mystery there. But it doesn't spell out who the little horn is. And I vaguely remembered what they call the Anglo-American world power being associated with the little horn in the Watchtower books. But I think that was from a different vision, and I couldn't make it fit with the little horn. I couldn't figure out who it was supposed to be in this vision. And more importantly for me, I wanted to know what the 2,300 days meant. it still seemed to me like the sort of thing that ought to mean something. So I go and check the Watchtower books. Felt kind of like when you look at the back of the book for the answers. Felt almost like cheating. But I go and look at I come across an explanation of it in the book Daniel's Prophecy. And it was absolute nonsense. Like the kind of nonsense that punches you in the face with how absurd it is. It was, I'm fairly comfortable saying, the dumbest thing I've ever read. So I'm going to try to explain to you the Watchtower explanation of the 2,300 days. So it starts here saying the 2,300 days constitute a prophetic period. Hence, a prophetic year of 360 days is involved. And then it cites a passage in Revelation where a year is 360 days, which totally couldn't have been because the author of Revelation didn't know how long a year was. It must have been that that's a special prophetic year. This 2,300 days then would amount to 6 years, 4 months, and 20 days. So already I'm getting a little skeptical because they're telling me that when God says 2,300 days, what he really means is that each group of 360 days is actually 365 days, plus maybe a leap day here and there. But let's go with it. When did this start? When was this period? Well, during World War II, Jehovah's Witnesses were fiercely persecuted in the lands of the Anglo-American dual world power. Therefore, the 2,300 days must be associated with that war. That strikes me as horrible abuse of the word therefore. But let's keep reading. For the next part, I pretty much have to read the whole paragraph because, well, you'll see. For the holy place, quote marks because it's quoting the verse, for the holy place to be brought or restored to what it should be, the 2,300 days must have begun when it previously was in the right condition from God's standpoint. At the earliest, this was on June 1st, 1938, when the Watchtower published Part 1 of the article Organization. Part 2 appeared in the issue of June 15th, 1938. Counting 2,300 days, which is of course not actually 2,300 days, but actually 6 years, 4 months, and 20 days on the Hebrew calendar, from June 1st or June 15th, 1938, brings us to October 8th or October 22nd, 1944. On the first day of a special assembly held at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on September 30th and October 1st, 1944, the Watchtower Society president spoke on the subject, The Theocratic Alignment Today. At the annual corporate meeting on October 2nd, the Society's charter was amended in an effort to bring it as close to a theocratic arrangement as the law would allow. So to recap, the angel is giving Daniel a vision about beasts representing world-dominating empires. And then after talking about the British Empire, apparently, he suddenly starts talking about how much time would pass between a magazine article about organization and a corporate charter amendment that no one even remembers mere decades later, or probably even years later. I don't think anyone cared even when it was happening. Certainly no one cares now. I've never met a Jehovah's Witness who even knows what amendments were made in October 1944. Or cares at all about this magazine article called Organization. Both of them are historically irrelevant even to Jehovah's Witnesses. So the angel wants to tell us how much time is going to pass between this magazine or these two magazines and this talk. And we have to change 360 days into 365 days. And we have two possible starting dates and 3 possible end dates. And you still can't make it add up to 2,300? What kind of prophecy is this? So that was stupid. I thought surely they have some justification for this absurdity that I just read. So I tried to look back and see how they kind of try to build up to this, especially identifying the little horn as what they call the Anglo-American dual world power, which is like the British Empire and the USA together, except that the British Empire doesn't exist anymore. So now it's like the USA and the UK, I suppose. But yeah, apparently this is an empire, and it's the little horn. And I go back to the previous chapter, and they try to argue that the Anglo-American world power grew out of one of the horns because one of them was the king of Macedonia. It was a General Cassander, and he was conquered by the Romans, and Britain was a Roman province at one time, which somehow means that the British Empire is an offshoot of General Cassander's kingdom. It just kept getting worse. Like, there was no saving this thing. But I still felt like this needed an explanation. This 2,300 days is written in such a way and in such a place in the Bible that either it means something or God is just wasting everyone's time. Or, of course, God didn't write it. And I also knew from, my previous experience of looking things up, like the Goliath thing that I think I mentioned in one of my videos that I had looked up, and I realized that it turns out if you Google things, you might learn stuff about the Bible that isn't in a Watchtower. And obviously the Watchtower was grossly failing me in this particular verse. So I go and Google the 2,300 days in the little horn, and all the pages that came up were discussing one question. Some pages were saying the little horn was Antiochus Epiphanes, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, and there were other pages arguing that it couldn't possibly be Antiochus Epiphanes. But everybody was talking about yes or no on Antiochus Epiphanes, and there's a good reason for that, because as it turns out, the description of what the little horn was doing matches pretty exactly what Antiochus Epiphanes was doing. He was, putting pagan idols or altars in Yahweh's temple and banning Hebrew practices like circumcision and all kinds of mean and nasty things, and probably littering. I don't know. Nobody liked him. And it turns out that the things that he was doing were matching very well the description in that prophecy. And not just that one vision, but he matches the king of the north in chapter 11. Let me check my notes again. Yeah, chapter 11. He's the king of the north. Again, the description is written cryptically, but it closely lines up to what Antiochus Epiphanes was doing. Same with the other little horn from chapter 7, which, by the way, is probably my favorite picture from the Daniel's prophecy book. It's quite reminds me of Tungy from Kung Pao. So yeah, there was some seriously strong evidence tying the little horn with Antiochus Epiphanes. Someone reading Daniel at that time would have been absolutely certain that it's talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. Certainly more so than someone today would think that it's about the British Empire for some reason. And I keep looking and I find that there's surprisingly solid evidence for saying that the book of Daniel was written during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, that it was not written in the 6th century BC as it claims to have been written. It was actually written in the 2nd century BCE when this Greek king Antiochus was defiling Yahweh's temple. One of the reasons they say this is because the King of the North description accurately matches Antiochus's campaigns right up to his untimely death, which the prophet gets wrong. If he had written after the king died, he surely would have gotten that detail right too. There's a couple of other things too that confirm or at least support the late authorship of the book of Daniel. For instance, the Hebrew Bible was, when it was compiled, it was made up of 3 separate canons. So kind of like most Bibles that you'll find today, there's clearly 2 canons there. There's the Old Testament and the New Testament, and they're put together as being the Bible. So the Hebrew Bible was made up of the Torah, which is the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. There was the prophets, which is a separate canon put together a little bit later. And then there was the writings, which is a little bit more miscellaneous, mostly later works that were not included in either the first 2 canons. The Book of Daniel would be a pretty obvious choice to put in the canon of the prophets, and it surely would have been if it had been written when the prophets were compiled. The Book of Daniel is in fact listed among the writings, and the most likely explanation for that is that when the Book of Daniel was written, the prophets' canon was already considered complete, and so it couldn't be added to that canon after the fact. There's also Greek loanwords in the Book of Daniel in chapter 3. The author is describing some musical instruments, and for some of the musical instruments, for 3 of them I think, he actually uses their Greek names, which would be very strange for someone writing in Babylonia or in the, after it's been conquered by the Persians, when the Greeks are a distant collection of city-states. They weren't an empire by any means at that time. It would make perfect sense for someone writing in Judea, or whatever that area was called, in the 2nd century BCE, when Hellenistic culture was spreading throughout that region. It was spread like crazy after Alexander the Great's campaigns. So there seemed to be overwhelming evidence supporting the Book of Daniel being written in the 2nd century BCE during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, and it fit in perfectly with the general theme of the book, which is that Yahweh saved us from the Babylonians. He's going to save us from the trouble that we're in now, without explicitly mentioning the trouble that they're in now, because they don't want to get, imprisoned or executed or whatever happens when you're circulating anti-government books at that time. So 2,300 days in Daniel 8:14. Is it rapture in 1844? Is it a charter amendment in 1944? Or is it zealous religious Jews predicting the fall of their much despised pagan king? Doesn't matter that they got the date wrong. That's completely consistent with the theory. That part in particular was more wishful thinking than anything else. I didn't much care for that option because it caused serious problems for the rest of my worldview, which I had to deal with. But it had too much evidence for me to simply ignore it. And the other explanations that I had were completely ridiculous. The only likely explanation was that the Book of Daniel was in fact a 2nd century forgery. There's even another thing that I think I forgot to mention was at the end of chapter 8, where Daniel is instructed to keep the vision secret because it refers to the distant future, which makes a really convenient excuse for the Jews who found the Book of Daniel in the 2nd century. They're like, look, it was secret. The angel told them to keep it a secret. And so that's why nobody's heard of it until just now, because we totally didn't just write it. No, we totally found it. And it's totally like 400 years old. So yeah. So as I started considering the fallout of that on my belief system, one of the first things that came to mind was the prophecy about 1914, because that's also based off of the Book of Daniel, chapter 4 in particular. So I go back and look at chapter 4 of Daniel, and I'm reading it like it's almost like I'm reading it for the first time, even though I've read it many times before. But I'm reading it as though it's with fresh eyes, you might say. And I realize this isn't an end times prophecy at all. There's absolutely nothing in the text to suggest that there's some kind of second fulfillment. It's a pretty self-contained story. Nebuchadnezzar gets a dream. Daniel interprets the dream, explains to Nebuchadnezzar that he's going to go mad for 7 years. He does that. 7 years later, he gets better and praises Yahweh. And it's completely consistent with the theme of the book of Daniel and with the agenda of the second century authors of the book of Daniel, which is about Yahweh humiliating kings who are mistreating his people. And it serves their purposes because they're hoping for the same sort of thing to happen to the king who's currently mistreating the people of Israel. And so that was, of course, quite a shock to realize that just a plain reading of the text now shows that the Watchtower Society is completely wrong about another major doctrine of theirs, which made it seem likely, well, how many more things are they wrong about? How many more things have I been missing just by treating them as some kind of authority, realizing that the Watchtower Society is not an authority of any kind, that half of these things they're just making up, made me start to remember some of the other things that I'd learned about other parts of the Bible that I'd just kind of dismissed in the past. Things like the documentary hypothesis that I had a passing familiarity with. Things like the multiple authorship of the book of Isaiah, for example, that the second part of Isaiah was written much later than the first part, and that many of the events that it describes were also being described after the fact. And I suddenly realized that it was completely 100% plausible that the Bible was really required no supernatural explanation whatsoever, and which was kind of a relief in a way, because everything else in the universe that I can see doesn't require any magic to run. Everything seems to make sense as it is, and now the Bible fits in with the rest of the universe in that way, that it's a very influential book by all means, but there's nothing magic or divine about it. It's just historical literature and religious literature. And so that's when I knew I couldn't. If I was right about that, I had to stop being a Jehovah's Witness. I couldn't go on pretending to believe something that wasn't true, even if let's say the rest of the Bible was true, but just the part about 1914, that was enough of a deal breaker in my mind. That if they're holding on to this 1914 date when it's obviously wrong, that was a good enough reason for me not to be Jehovah's Witness anymore. It could have been just about anything else. If I had picked the blood doctrine at that point, the refusal of blood transfusions, I could have just looked at that and seen that the Bible doesn't require someone to die and refuse a medical treatment based off of some commandment to Noah to not eat an animal's blood. All of these things were suddenly open to me. I suddenly could see without having to check mentally, is this okay? Is this what the Watchtower says? Is this an okay thought for me to have? The Watchtower no longer had any say in it. All I had was the Bible, history, my ability to reason, other sources of evidence, and the picture that it painted when you took Watchtower out of the picture was very, very different. There was still one other possibility that needed taken care of, and that was the possibility that it had all been some kind of elaborate satanic mind trick. Because, of course, Jehovah's Witnesses teach that Satan is this master deceiver who has the power to make just about anyone believe just about anything. If you can't even trust your own mind, right? Because his powers of deception are just that intense. And I had to deal with this possibility. But these same Jehovah's Witnesses teachings also tell me that Jehovah can read hearts, and that Jehovah would not allow his faithful ones to succumb to the devil's attacks. So I started praying. I was praying to God to prove me wrong. I figured if God exists, if Jehovah exists, and then he surely knows the situation that I'm in. He knows the research that I've done and the evidence that I found and the conclusions that it logically points me to. I said, prove me wrong. If I'm wrong, show me. Not so much because I wanted to be wrong, but because I wanted to know the truth. If I was wrong, I wanted to know that. If I was right, I wanted to know that. One way or the other, I had to know. So I prayed. I don't know how long I prayed for. I prayed and I cried and I wanted to give it my absolute best shot. But of course, there were nothing special happened. There were no miracles. The universe persistently continued making sense. And the result was entirely consistent with what I'd come to realize, which was that I had spent my entire life up to that point in whole soul dedication to a fictional character by the name of Jehovah.